The next topic in this course deals with Japanese American internment during World War II. And in case you're not familiar at all with this episode, this is when Japanese Americans on the West Coast were put into concentration camps. They were imprisoned for many years following Pearl Harbor. And you see 120,000 Japanese Americans put into these concentration camps. And by the way, two-thirds of those 120,000, two-thirds of them were U.S. born. In other words, they were American citizens, but that didn't matter. As we'll discuss, their constitutional rights were abridged, they were suspended. And we're also going to see how this perennial theme in this whole course of History 123, the theme of perpetual foreigner. And as we know, this is linked to the ideology of Orientalism. We're going to see how this theme figures prominently in this discussion of Japanese internment. I should say today that, this is recognized as the most shameful and deplorable chapter, not just in Asian American history or ethnic history, but even in U.S. legal history. And indeed, for many decades after World War II, this episode was hardly acknowledged. It's kind of swept under the carpet in the historical record. And even Japanese Americans who survived the ordeal of internment, they repressed this memory. They refused to talk about their experiences in public. But we'll see by the 1980s, after decades of repressed memories, right? You'll see Japanese Americans, some leaders and so forth, they began to clamor for an official apology and redress for this whole event. And indeed, especially after the civil rights movement, I should say, our presidents began to address this grievous violation of civil rights. Now, at the time, even during this period of redress and restitution, it was considered, yes, shameful, but considered an aberration. In other words, it was kind of an outlier. It's just an exception to the rule. But here's the thing about that way of thinking about Japanese internment. And hopefully you grasp this by now. Was it really an aberration, or was it continuous with the past episodes of the way Asians were treated in the United States, right? Well, the argument going to be made here is that it is not an aberration. In fact, it's a logical conclusion of this culmination, if you will. It's a culmination, if you will, of things like the 1882 Exclusion Act, um, aliens ineligible for citizenship, all the racial violence perpetrated against Asians, and so on and so forth. Well, this falls right in line with the rest of that, okay, that preceded Japanese internment. Okay, well, the imprisonment of these 120,000 members of a particular ethnic group, Japanese Americans, it's unprecedented in U.S. history. And yet, as we know, as students of Asian American history right now, um, yes, it's fueled by wartime hysteria and paranoia following Pearl Harbor, which was, of course, a terrible attack on U.S. military installations. But as I mentioned, this is a culmination of anti Japanese sentiment and more generally anti Asian discrimination. Okay. All right. So, in other words, race was the overriding reason for their incarceration, not simply, quote, military necessity. Now I'm introducing these ideas, and it'll make more sense. I'm kind of previewing what we're going to discuss. In fact, let's look at the next slide here, which it's going to list some important keywords here. All right. And some of this I'll discuss right now, but some I will discuss as we discuss, as this topic unfolds, okay, as we discuss the topic. Let me say, first of all, that this first keyword Issei and Nisei. Now, this refers to how the Japanese um, thought about the generations of immigrants in the United States. We're talking about family generations, right? The Issei were the first generation of Japanese immigrants to the United States. Okay, that's the Issei. So what are the Nisei? Nisei are the second generation. In other words, they're born in the United States. And I should say this off the bat. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them were fully assimilated, fully acculturated to American culture, American norms, the American worldview. Just like myself, personally speaking, I'm second generation Filipino American. Well, similarly, you see with the Nisei, they're second generation Japanese American. Just like myself, they don't even speak the native tongue of their parents, right? They don't speak Japanese, in other words. Many of them, not all of them, but they're fully American, fully Americanized. They hardly have any connection, whether it's cultural, political, emotional, even to their parents' home country of Japan. Okay, so the Japanese, in other words, in the United States, came up with these terms to um, designate between the generations. Again, Issei is the first generation, Nisei is the second generation. Executive Order 9066 is obviously an executive order, meaning it's issued by the president, the executive office, without Congress being involved. And 9066 is going to order Japanese Americans on the west coast of the United States to report to assembly centers first. In other words, they have to report to assembly centers before they're whisked away to these concentration camps, okay, which are going to be further east, away from the west coast. Fifth column, the next key term, is basically this idea of domestic sabotage and domestic espionage during times of war, especially. Okay, and this is going to connect with Japanese internment because the fear was that the Japanese Americans, after Pearl Harbor and as we entered World War II against the Japanese Empire, the fear was that the Japanese Americans were going to constitute a fifth column. That is, they're going to be involved in, espionage. They're going to spy upon Americans on behalf of the Japanese government, right? The Japanese state. In other words, they're going to be more loyal, and their allegiance is going to be directed towards Japan. That was the fear, okay? The fear was the Japanese would constitute a fifth column after Pearl Harbor. And indeed, this is the reason, as we'll see, why it was perceived to be a military necessity to imprison them. And this goes back to, goes down to here. General DeWitt would be the general in charge of organizing this logistically, right? The mobilization, right, and then the subsequent incarceration of the Japanese. Okay, he's in charge with this whole thing, and in his official statement that justifies internment, he deems it as, quote, a military necessity. Okay, and if you pressed him further, he would say, well, they could possibly form a fifth column. They'll be involved in sabotage and espionage. Okay. Now, we already know Orientalism and perpetual foreigner, and politics of incarceration I will discuss as we get to that part of the lecture. So too with the Korematsu case and the 442nd Regiment. Okay, but for now, we know Issei Nisei, Executive Order 9066, fifth column, Orientalism, and General DeWitt's statement of military necessity. So, again, this is previewing, and I will, remind students again that we're discussing about let's say, fifth column or what have you. But now we could begin to discuss Japanese internment from the very beginning. So we'll do that with the next video.